Geometry and three-dimensionality are focal points for artistic innovation in Renaissance Europe, from linear perspective in Florence to empirical perspective in Flanders. Last episode, we also saw how Venetian painters like Giovanni Bellini experimented with light effects, constructing space and figure using color and optics rather than simply line. This is the basis for the traditional dichotomy between Venice and Florence, the Venetian emphasis on light and color, called colore, and the Florentine emphasis on line and design, disegno. In Season 1, Episode 2, we see that this distinction becomes a false dichotomy by the High Renaissance in the 1510s, but in this episode, we'll examine what line and design really meant to the new young artists active in late 15th century central Italy. There, painting was an art and a science in equal measure. It was an extension of geometry and mathematics. Developing in tandem with this interest in compositional anatomy was an intensifying interest in human anatomy too. And together, these threads of art and science interweave to shine light on the anatomy of Renaissance painting in every sense of that phrase. Let's begin by looking at the anatomy of space, that is, the structure of pictorial settings. And for this, we'll turn to one of the greatest polymaths of the Italian Renaissance, a mathematician artist who was obsessed with precise geometric design. He's not Leonardo da Vinci. In fact, he's about 30 years older. His name is Piero della Francesca, one I really want you to remember. In his early career, Piero della Francesca works in his Tuscan hometown of San Sepolcro, but later he moves to Urbino in the mountainous region of the Marche to work for the Duke there. This is the first piece Piero paints in Urbino. At first sight, it's unassuming, but this small panel is deceptively simple. We can trace the perspective quite easily. As a specialist in geometry, linear perspective came naturally to Piero. The vanishing point, horizon line, diagonals in the foreground, it's clear and cleanly done. But notice how Piero sets up his space. It's partitioned into two unrelated scenes. The sizes of the figures on left and right are obviously different, but also look at the light and shadow. On the left-hand side of the panel, light shines in from the right. But on the right-hand side, the figures' shadows fade to the right, so light shines in from the left. There's that dissonance. The light is mirrored. It's our first pointer that there's more to this picture than initially meets the eye. The next step is to look at the subjects. At left, we see a figure being whipped, tied to a classical column. This is the biblical scene wherein Romans whip Christ before his crucifixion, called the Flagellation of Christ. The illusion of spatial recession is astonishing. The other side of the panel presents a completely different situation. Three men chatting, paying no attention to the flagellation scene. They're situated in another space, but also seemingly another time. Whoever they are, whatever they're discussing, we get the sense that Piero intends to draw a connection between their circumstances and those of Christ, meaning perhaps some sort of injustice is at play here, echoing the injustice of Christ's flagellation. So, who are these three men? That question has plagued us for centuries. One solution is offered by a political reading. The Duke of Urbino at this time was a condottiere or mercenary called Federico da Montefeltro. Federico only rose to power after his half-brother was unjustly assassinated, and we can speculate that the half-brother could be the man in red at the center of the trio. Two of his close advisors were also assassinated, and they might be the flanking figures. So Piero could be memorializing this martyrdom by comparing it to the injustice of the flagellation. But I hope you approach these interpretations with a critical mind and realize that this one sounds slightly tenuous, plus there's a clue that points in a different direction. If you watched episode 3 about portraiture in Florence and Flanders, you saw this portrait medallion by Pisanello depicting the Byzantine Emperor John Palaeologus with that iconic imperial headdress. That seated figure at far left, he has that same hat, a style reserved for the Byzantine Emperor only. This is such a close resemblance that it's unlikely to be mere coincidence. So then the question becomes, why would Piero include the Byzantine emperor in an image of Christ's flagellation? Well, the date of this painting is tentatively the late 1450s. If you watched last episode on Venice, you know that Constantinople, now Istanbul, was conquered by the Ottomans in 1453. So if Piero places the former emperor next to the tortured Christ, is he drawing a parallel between the fall of the Byzantine Empire and the Christian suffering shown here? Both events reflecting a fall of some Christian entity. Now, this might sound like a stretch, but the conquest of Constantinople had significant implications for international commerce, and many Italians had trade interests in that region. So it would have been a very hot-button issue in Piero's time. But this still doesn't explain the three figures on the right. We may never know the true function and meaning of this small study in perspective, but the construction of two spaces with mirrored lighting and mirrored subject matter makes for a compelling puzzle. Notice how relative to the three figures at right, Piero relegates the religious subject to the background, yet our eyes are still drawn to the flagellation scene since that's where the spatial recession occurs. Piero della Francesca offers a pictorial puzzle with geometry as our guide. I'm now showing you a painting by another artist from Urbino, Fra Carnevale, that reveals two themes in the Italian pictures of this period. One, the blending of painting and architecture, and two, the conceit of transposition, in other words, situating biblical subjects or historical subjects in anachronistic Renaissance settings, similar to what Carpaccio does in his St. Ursula cycle from last episode. We saw both of these elements in Piero's Flagellation too, and indeed Fra Carnevale's picture is very much indebted to Piero. Like in the Flagellation, Fra Carnevale also relegates the religious scene in this panel to the background, but he takes it to the extreme. Look at this elegant conception of a classical building with beautiful marble reliefs, arched windows, opening up to a piazza where all these women are congregating. One brings her child. The attention to perspective is apparent. Again, a system of diagonals in the foreground, receding to a single vanishing point in the back. But look closely at what's happening under the loggia. A woman reclines on a bed, looking very exhausted, being tended to, and there's an infant in the foreground who appears to be female. She's the newborn of the reclining mother. Now, this is unusual iconography, and biblically, it fits most closely with the birth of the Virgin, which is itself an uncommon subject. And Fra Carnevale makes that subject even more obscure with this confusing yet carefully engineered composition. Why would he purposely obscure the birth scene in this way? Well, one answer is that his intended subject here really isn't the birth of the Virgin at all. Rather, it's the exquisite piece of classical architecture that takes center stage. That's what Fra Carnevale wants us to see first, to appreciate most. And that seems to be the message of this bizarre composition. So Fra Carnevale integrates the birth of the Virgin into a scene of contemporary Italian life, a case of both spatial and temporal transposition. To entertain this idea some more, let's look at one of my favorites in all of European painting, an Annunciation by another artist working in the Marche, Carlo Crivelli. Crivelli was born in Venice, but after an adulterous affair, he was kicked out of Venice and fled to the mountainous Marche. There in the tiny town of Ascoli Piceno, he forged his own path, developing a highly individualistic aesthetic that was heavily criticized during his time, but that has such a unique, vibrant, colorful beauty. He takes Mantegna's linearity and essentially turns up the saturation. The first thing you might notice about this Annunciation is that it's really quite crowded, not with figures, but with buildings, not unlike Fra Carnevale's picture. This is a Renaissance street corner embellished with magnificent classicizing columns borrowed from Mantegna. We also see oriental carpets imported into Italy through Venice. So this isn't your typical Annunciation setting. It's not in an enclosed garden or veranda or church. It's a contemporary 15th century setting, just like in the Flemish Marot altarpiece from episode 2. In fact, in this scene, the act of the Annunciation hasn't happened yet at all. The Archangel Gabriel hasn't even reached Mary's house. He's been interrupted en route by the patron saint of the town, Ascoli Piceno, Saint Emidius, who carries a model of the town. What's already arrived in Mary's room, though, is the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, although no one takes notice except this man and his young child, again, contemporary Renaissance figures. This is an altarpiece for public display, and by repositioning, resituating the Annunciation across time and space, Crivelli brings it closer to his 15th century audience. There's a wealth of curious details too, signature quirks of the artist. The apple references the forbidden fruit of the Garden of Eden, symbolic of sin. More unusual is this cucumber, which is something Crivelli loved to paint. It's everywhere in his work. It's also thought to symbolize sin by way of a biblical reference. The resplendent peacock above serves as a counterpoint to these sinful fruits with its promise of immortality, redemption, and Christ's resurrection. There was a medieval legend that peacock meat could never rot, leading it to be associated with the notions of the afterlife and eternity. Look at the arched bridge in the background. A messenger pigeon presents a document to this man, and this is my favorite detail in this panel. This is another act of Annunciation, a secular one with a lowercase a, embedded into this biblical capital A Annunciation. It's such a clever play on the subject matter. That document is likely a papal declaration issued around 1486, around this time, granting Ascoli Piceno the right to self-government after years under papal control. So, on another level, Crivelli's altarpiece celebrates the town's newfound freedom. This is an annunciation in a religious sense, but also very much a secular one. So artists play with the concept of transposing biblical subjects into contemporary settings while experimenting with space and architecture. But let's return to Piero della Francesca, where we started. I mentioned Piero working for the Duke of Urbino, the condottiere Federico da Montefeltro, whose commissions and humanist interests give us great insight into the 15th century central Italian court. This is Federico himself, painted by Piero, facing his wife Battista Sforza. Think back to episode 3 where we discussed portraiture at length. This is a portrait diptych with both figures shown in profile against an open panoramic landscape, but this is a very intentional portrait. Look closely, for example, at Federico's facial features. Do you notice anything out of the ordinary? The top portion of his nose, in particular, looks odd. There's a chunk of it missing. And notice how we can't see the right half of his face. It's because he lost his right eye in a jousting tournament, and he had his nose bridge removed, we think, to expand his visual field. Meanwhile, Battista has ghostly pale skin, a hallmark of Renaissance beauty, but she actually died shortly before this was painted, which raises questions about this diptych's function. What's interesting about the physical anatomy of this diptych is that it's double-sided, with allegorical scenes on the reverse. They're called triumphs, smaller scale versions of works like Mantegna's Triumphs of Caesar, but with a philosophical twist. These do celebrate one of Federico's victories, but they also celebrate the virtue of the couple. Accompanying their chariots are the personifications of such virtues as justice, temperance, and faith. On the left wing, Battista's wing, we see her chariot drawn by unicorns, very much symbolic of purity. And I love the inscription, which acts like a caption. It reads, "She who retained modesty in good fortune now flies through all the mouths of men, adorned with the praise of her great husband's deeds." Indeed, Federico was a well-respected civil leader. In his capacity as Count and later Duke of Urbino, he was genuinely invested in the happiness and security of his people. Notably, he took good care of the families of soldiers who were killed in the line of duty. He was also a remarkable humanist scholar of the classics who aspired for Urbino to rival Florence, which I hope you've seen is a goal shared by all the other Italian courts we've discussed, from the Este in Ferrara to the Gonzaga in Mantua. And it's this spirit of competition that was so conducive to cultural and artistic blossoming. The best glimpse into Federico's humanist court is given by this room, which is a very unique anatomy, both in its construction and its decoration. It was originally built for Federico's palace at Gubbio, designed by the Sienese architect painter extraordinaire Francesco di Giorgio Martini, and assembled in Florence, but it's now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a private study, or studiolo, something in vogue among the ruling class in Quattrocento Italy. Studioli were the hallmark of intellectual sophistication, and they were decorated commensurately. This remarkable wood paneling is done using a technique called intarsia, where different colors of wood are inlaid to generate the illusion of depth and three-dimensionality, an alternate approach to depicting linear perspective. It's just this spectacular feat of carpentry. We see trompe-l'oeil cabinets housing various curiosities and scientific instruments, something akin to a 16th, 17th century cabinet of curiosities. Musical instruments, string instruments, an organ, books, a quadrant, and an armillary sphere, tools for marine navigation. Somewhere there's an exotic bird, a parrot, very refined objects that serve to reflect the good taste of their owner. On this very convincing bench sits a mazzocchio, the toroid headdress that Paolo Uccello from episode 1 had loved for its perspectival intrigue. Francesco di Giorgio Martini is playing with space and geometry here too, but infusing those ideas with interior design. In reconstructing the space, we think that hanging above the intarsia were 7 elegant personifications of the liberal arts painted by Justus of Ghent, a Flemish artist invited to Urbino. So Federico operated a court that was very much open to international exchange. The Spanish artist Pedro Berruguete was also here at some point. Now, only 2 of these painted personifications survive, both showing enthroned women with men who presumably practiced the associated art form. In this one, we see her gesturing to an organ, making us think she represents music. The other is more ambiguous, but most likely personifies rhetoric. The gentle, raking light in these paintings produces an enigmatic, almost dreamlike aura. Notice they're lit from opposite angles, rhetoric from the left, music from the right. This suggests the pictorial lighting is intentional, perhaps designed to match the angle of natural light shining through the studiolo's windows. And the varnish and wax on the paint surface points to candles once having burned below them. Imagine reading in this space in candlelight, surrounded by spectacular intarsia, lost in thought, watched over by the 7 liberal arts. This was the magic of the Studiolo. So from Piero's Flagellation to Francesco di Giorgio Martini's woodwork, I hope you see that artists late into the 15th century are still intensely interested in the power and potential of linear perspective, the concept that set off this season in episode 1. Around 1480, Piero della Francesca publishes his own treatise on the topic, On Perspective in Painting, dedicated to Duke Federico da Montefeltro. And so Brunelleschi established what perspective was. Alberti explained why perspective was necessary to produce a good work of art, and Piero outlined how to master it. Piero's treatise was like an instructional manual for painters. It became the standard reference text on perspective for the rest of the century. To better capture the range of Piero's oeuvre, I want to show two more works by him. This is his celebrated Resurrection and one of the greatest standalone frescoes of the Renaissance for its awesome grandeur and for its clever composition. The anatomy of this figurative arrangement is pyramidal, anchored by Christ, whose face is a vanishing point forming the apex. We see him head on, and you might not realize it initially, but we see the slumbering soldiers beneath him from a different perspective. We see them from below. So there's a second vanishing point below the sarcophagus, and as a result, Christ seems even more imposing, but also he's situated in a different divine plane of being from the mortals below. The tangle of legs in the foreground is impossible to separate. There aren't enough legs here for 4 people, but this makes for a cleaner composition. It intentionally prevents clutter. The soldier who faces toward us might be a self-portrait. Christ also divides the picture in half, and try to see if you can spot differences between the left and right halves of the image. What do you notice about the trees? Barren on the left, lush with growth on the right. Perhaps this is contrasting winter and spring, or despair and hope, death and resurrection. The trees here underscore the transformative magic of this biblical moment. The fresco today remains in Piero della Francesca's hometown of San Sepolcro. The town was nearly bombed in World War II, but an officer, Tony Clark, knew of Piero's resurrection and called off the bombardment in order to save the picture for us today. This altarpiece is a later work from Piero's stint at the court of Urbino. It's really a summation of his skill, and it's painted on the occasion of the birth of the Duke's son, so appropriately, it shows the birth of Christ. Piero situates us under this monumental, semicircular apse, this church-like setting with coffers holding blossoming flowers in homage to classical architecture, not unlike Masaccio's Holy Trinity. From the massive shell, symbolic of fertility, dangles a single egg, reminding of Mary's virginity and purity. Federico's here too, and you probably recognized him already, in profile and in armor, admiring the Christ child, an infant who, in this visual narrative, doubles as his own. This altarpiece attests to Piero's total mastery of composition as a science, but also his facility with the oil medium. So I've been using the term anatomy loosely to indicate how a composition is structured, how a pictorial space is formulated and organized, alluding to ideas of perspective and geometry. And now I want to expand the notion of anatomy some more. One often overlooked 15th century application of perspective is urban planning. It was believed that perfect classical proportions could intellectually and morally elevate cities and their residents, offering a sort of divine protection to those who lived within its bounds. Sforzinda is an example of this perfectly symmetrical city, planned for the Sforza Dukes of Milan. And although it was never built, it represents the possibility and beauty of the ideal Renaissance city as a respectable aspiration. Ideal cities were very Greco-Roman in character, unsurprisingly. In their geometry, architecture, decorative programming, they sought to revive classical glory, and in this sense they're quintessentially Renaissance creations. Artists in Urbino envisioned quite a few, and their ideas are immortalized in a group of 3 panels showing these perfectly proportioned city plazas in perfect linear perspective, probably painted under the auspices of Federico da Montefeltro. We don't know who painted these works, but we can infer associations with Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who designed Federico's Studiolo, and Fra Carnevale, who painted that weird Birth of the Virgin with a similar classical piazza. Anchoring this scene, ascribed to Fra Carnevale, is a Roman triumphal arch with other Roman columns. And the streets are eerily empty. It reminds me of Lockdown 2020. But there's also a measured serenity in the quiet perfection of it all. This is a picture that transports you to a different and ideal time and place. This second ideal city from the Gemelli Gallery is a vedutta, a view painting, because this piazza opens to a port, reminding us that trade and commerce form the backbone of an Italian city-state's economy. It offers the pragmatic suggestion that the ideal city should have access to a port on the Mediterranean, something that Florence and Milan wrestled over in the wars in Lombardy for years. And looking at this third and final ideal city, with the Pantheon-like structure at center, I can't help but be reminded of another artist's work from more than 4 centuries later. The empty piazzas, envisioned by Italian modernist Giorgio de Chirico. Is he looking back to Renaissance-era influences from his native Tuscany? In his work, there is the added tension of industrialism and modernity, but the abstracted, three-dimensional setting still carries with it unmistakable traces of Italian Renaissance spatial anatomy. Catching up with developments in Florence around 1475, we find ourselves among artists who are more determined than ever and closer than ever to naturalistically depicting the human body, and particularly the male nude. If Piero della Francesca was devoted to perfecting the anatomy of space, these Florentine artists were intensely dedicated to the anatomy of figure. It's a tradition that stems from the classical notion of heroic nudity, something Donatello revived with his bronze David in the 1440s. But Donatello and even Piero della Francesca in the Marche had relied solely on visual observation to approximate accurate human anatomy. In the 1470s, however, the Florentine Pollaiuolo brothers would go further by working with human cadavers. This woodcut from a later medical book shows us how it would have been done. Now, morgues weren't generally welcoming to curious artists, but Antonio and Piero del Pollaiuolo, in the spirit of discovery and also of competition with rival artists, used dissection to study muscles in particular, opening this door for future artists like Leonardo da Vinci. Since muscles are key to movement, accurately depicting the musculature would be key to infusing figures with dynamism and life. Antonio del Pollaiuolo's claim to fame is a print, an engraving, which he signed on a plaque hanging from this tree trunk at left. And the scene shows something highly unusual. What are these nude men doing? They wield all manner of weapons devilishly raised against their opponents. Swords, axes, bow and arrow, a knife. One has fallen to the ground, wounded. His companion tends to him on the battlefield. What the men lack, aside from clothes, are shields. 2 shields lie scattered on the ground. Evidently, this is a blunt force skirmish where it's every man for himself. In fact, we're not sure what this scene shows or means, whether it's a mythological reference or just a violent figment of Antonio da Pollaiuolo's imagination. What's most striking to me, however, is the hypermuscular appearance of each combatant. Notice how the musculature is outlined with incredibly high definition, using distinct line rather than light and shade. In collaborations with his brother Piero, Antonio applied his study of human anatomy and kinesiology to painting. In this imposing altarpiece, the figures are just as muscular as the nude fighters. They're traced clearly with dark line, exemplifying Florentine painters' emphasis on line and design toward the end of the 15th century, an approach captured by the term disegno, meaning drawing or design in the Italian. Loosely, disegno involves crafting a careful composition using linear perspective and painting anatomically accurate figures as outlined forms. Compare this emphasis on line and design to the emphasis on light and color that Giovanni Bellini develops contemporaneously in Venice. Bellini prefers using subtle shading and color blending to produce realism and definition, rather than using line. His approach is called colore, so therein lies that distinction between Florentine disegno and Venetian colore, a dichotomy that blurs over time as we reach the High Renaissance. I discussed that evolution in Season 1, Episode 2. Back in the Pollaiuolo altarpiece, Saint Sebastian, who secretly converted to Christianity in the 3rd century, is bound to a post and shot with arrows. It's a cruel martyrdom. Depictions of Sebastian were popular because his wounds were symbolically linked to buboes, those swellings caused by bubonic plague. We see 4 arrows already piercing his body, 4 more coming from below. 2 other archers ready their bows. The Pollaiuolo brothers arrange their figures in a symmetrical pyramid with the saint at the apex looking up at the heavens. Take a moment to observe the realism of the musculature and the triangle of the neck, the specificity of the veins on the forearm of the leftmost archer, a study in the flexion of the arm. This is unprecedented anatomical precision informed by dissection. But the background also reveals a stylistic synthesis, something that harkens back to Season 2, Episode 3. The valley and stream with boats in an open landscape is undoubtedly sourced from early Netherlandish paintings, or Florentine quotations thereof. On the left, we see Florence itself. You can just barely make out Brunelleschi's dome in the far background. This curiosity about the musculature and about dynamic movement wasn't, of course, limited to the Pollaiuolo or to Florence. In the coming decades, the artist Luca Signorelli would take hypermuscularity to even higher extremes. Signorelli's born, raised, and trained a Tuscan, but does his best work in the neighboring region of Umbria. Wherever he goes, he brings this very strong emphasis on hard line drawing, which would go on to influence Michelangelo. The fresco I'm showing here is part of a series about the apocalypse, Signorelli's masterpiece for the cathedral of the Umbrian city Orvieto. Here, dead bodies rise and reassemble in preparation for the Last Judgment. Each tendon, ligament, and sinew comes back to life, these fleshy, zombie-like beings regaining strength one by one. Look at those exaggerated muscles. They're not so much about precision as they are about drama. The painterly obsession with anatomy seeped quickly into the world of sculpture. In 1490s Florence, an emerging teenage sculptor would produce this relief of a battle scene from Greek mythology. The 16-year-old Michelangelo. The dance of arms and serpentine contortion of these figures call to mind Roman high reliefs like the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus, but also Pollaiuolo's Battle of the Nudes. We see the animated intensity and muscularity of these male bodies, an interest that will come to define Michelangelo's practice. But parts of this relief aren't quite complete. The negative space between figures isn't 100% carved out. Chisel marks are still visible in parts. This work is unfinished, non finito, either intentionally or otherwise, perhaps inspired by Plato's notion that physical objects can never match their capital F form. Notice too how Michelangelo's early inclinations very much align with Signorelli's emphasis on line and muscularity, and indeed Signorelli's Orvieto fresco cycle becomes a major influence in Michelangelo's Last Judgment for the Sistine altar wall. You'll notice that the Pollaiuolo brothers are new players in the Florentine Renaissance as I've covered it. In episode 1, we saw the first generation of Renaissance artists in the city, Brunelleschi, Masaccio, Donatello, roughly contemporaneous with Van Eyck in the north. Andrea del Castagno leads us toward a next wave of activity in the 1440s. That group included Fra Filippo Lippi, Benozzo Gozzoli, and Domenico Veneziano. And by 1475, a third wave of Florentine masters emerge. They're the New Guard. We saw some of them in episode 3, like Botticelli and Domenico Ghirlandaio, working at the same time as Hans Memling in Bruges. Among them were also the Pollaiuolo brothers, and also their literal next-door neighbor, Andrea del Verrocchio. Now, of course, this is a rough categorization. It's based loosely on stylistic trends and doesn't exactly align with the painter's generations or ages themselves, but it's a good reference to keep in mind. Let's now dive deeper into this third wave of activity, starting with Verrocchio, who himself was not a prolific artist, but who led a very, very busy workshop, one I cover in the Season 1 prologue. Verrocchio's workshop produced art using a factory-like assembly line. The master would provide a design, maybe paint the most important figures, maybe the Virgin Mary, for example, but then leave the rest of the paintings to assistants. Pre-made drawings would be pounced or traced onto panels to speed up production. And although his workshop worked and trained in all media, producing tons of paintings in particular, Verrocchio's own specialty was sculpture. And he's perhaps best remembered for this one. We see the haloed Christ towering over a saint who tremulously reaches toward Christ's body with just 2 fingers as if to touch him. This is St. Thomas, who didn't believe Christ had really resurrected until he saw and touched him in the flesh. The graceful exchange of gestures offers a dynamic dialogue between this pair of figures. The drapery provides textural rhythm. Verrocchio skillfully negotiates the boundary between stasis and motion, bringing Christ and St. Thomas to life. This painting from Verrocchio's workshop has several hands involved in its creation, none of which is Verrocchio himself. And let's consider why this might be a workshop product by a lesser hand. The figure's left arms and hands, for one, identically echo each other, clearly copied, pounced, from an existing drawing. And the winged angel's right hand mirrors one in another Verrocchio, only more anatomically awkward. The story here is that of Tobias and the angel, and it goes like this. A blind, elderly merchant named Tobit wanted to collect some outstanding debt from a distant land, and he sent his son Tobias to complete the task. Along the way, Tobias meets this benevolent angel, the Archangel Raphael, who becomes his guide. The Archangel Raphael was venerated in Florence as a saint for his protection of travelers. On their journey, Raphael tells Tobias to catch the fish that we see, because some of its organs could be made into medicine to cure Tobit's blindness. Here, the organs have already been removed, hence the blood, and they've been placed into the box Raphael holds. And later, Tobias collects the debt, but he also marries and cures Tobit's blindness, so a happy ending for all. Look closely at the two animals. See how the dog looks nearly transparent? You can see the landscape through its fur, meaning it's a later addition. But that fluff is absolutely tangible, so delicately rendered. The furs alone define its form. Look too at the fish with those beautiful highlights on the scales. The open mouth, so true to life. Some people think that these two animals are the work of the young Leonardo da Vinci, then Verrocchio's apprentice. Indeed, at this point in Verrocchio's workshop, there are two promising talents. One is Leonardo, the other, an Umbrian painter named Perugino. I mentioned Luca Signorelli, the hypermuscular artist, working in Umbria, which is landlocked by the Tuscan lowlands to the west and the mountains of the Marche to the east. Perugino was also working in Umbria, but he wasn't interested in ramping up the anatomical intensity to Pollaiuolo's or Signorelli's degree. Rather, he develops a signature grace and sweetness, which he went on to teach his most famous student, Raphael. These panels exemplify that softness. Warm flesh tones and saturated colors, rosy cheeks, no highly defined lines or hyper-developed muscles. Perugino's Madonnas are so calming to look at. You can see how closely the young Raphael follows his style. Even the Archangel Michael, who's just slain the devil on this leftmost panel, looks so serene. It's been cut down, so we only catch a glimpse of the devil's head and wing. Other than that, there's just no indication of brutality here. But as both artists matured, Perugino's style remained static, while Leonardo's style evolved. One fell out of fashion, the other became the greatest icon in art history. So Verrocchio is often used as a gateway to understanding the young Leonardo. In his formative years, the 1470s, early 80s, Leonardo produces exquisite studies like this study of drapery from the Louvre, which just attest his precocious artistic talent, his penchant for observation, and gift for visual expression. But Leonardo's deep interest in anatomy, both human and organismal, is at least in part rooted in his Florentine artistic upbringing, in the circle of Verrocchio and Pollaiuolo. That workshop training is his springboard, his introduction to what's buzzing in the Florentine art world, which, by the late 1470s, is human anatomy, a discipline in which Leonardo took great interest. This painting from the Vatican Museums is so unique and compelling because it's unfinished. It offers us a glimpse into Leonardo's working process, his thought process, allowing us to see his drawings yet to be covered by paint. This is the elderly Saint Jerome, living in the wilderness as a penitent hermit reflecting on sin. It's said that a lion befriended him after he removed a thorn from its paw. Leonardo models Jerome in trapezoidal form, an angular counterpoint to the lion's serpentine form in the foreground. The saint's figure is a composite of geometric forms, the triangle of his neck, with a carefully studied interlocking map of muscle and tendon, bone and vein, the circular outline of his head, his countenance betraying agony and suffering. There's just something so exquisitely and painfully moving about his expression. Look at the musculature of the shoulders, the skeletal ribcage. Just incredible. And Leonardo situates these elements in a landscape very similar to the one in his Virgin of the Rocks. He keeps thinking about these components of space and figure, meditating on them and returning to them in works from the 1480s and 90s. Imagine walking into a candlelit chapel and seeing before you this haunting image of St. Jerome. Leonardo leaves Florence for Milan to work for the Duke there before he's able to complete this picture. But the fact that it's physically unfinished adds, I think, to the emotional intensity conveyed in this gaunt figure. There's the sense of seeing beyond his corporeal form into his soul. I cover Leonardo's trajectory from Florence to Milan as seen through his paintings in Season 1, Episode 1, but here I want to spotlight his work with anatomy during this period. One of his projects for the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, is a colossal bronze equestrian statue that called for a 7-meter tall horse, the Gran Cavallo. And so Leonardo set off studying the minutiae of equine anatomy, documenting his thoughts in intensely detailed preparatory sketches where art, anatomy, kinesiology, and engineering melt into one. Leonardo's considerations were manifold: how to make the horse look convincing, alive, and how to translate that vision into reality, because casting this in bronze would pose a technical challenge. Now, very sadly, the project was interrupted by political upheaval, because when Ludovico needed metal for weaponry, he called off the equestrian statue project entirely. Leonardo's vision never came into fruition. Now, all the while, from the 1480s until his death, Leonardo is refining his understanding of human anatomy through cadaver dissection, just like the Pollaiuolo brothers did in the 70s. But Leonardo does it with the guidance of an anatomy professor. This delicate image of a breech fetus in utero represents his foray into embryology, and it's one of his most recognizable works. Amid blocks of his characteristic mirror writing, a touch of color brings this fetus to life. In depicting the uterus, there's the occasional structural mix-up where Leonardo mistakenly includes things found in other animals but not humans. But aside from this, it's an accurate study of the uterine vasculature. On a macro level, anatomy is closely tied to proportion. Not spatial or compositional proportion, but body proportions. Ancient civilizations often had standardized canons of proportions dictating ideal bodily measurements in their sculpture. The Roman architect Vitruvius even related the ideal proportions of the human body to the ideal proportions of classical architecture, both embodiments of natural harmony and, by extension, cosmic order. Vitruvius's writing inspired probably the most famous Renaissance drawing ever, Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. Vitruvius described the ideal human body as fitting within a square and, when outstretched, within a circle. At the center of the square would be the genitalia, and at the center of the circle, the navel. Leonardo details additional proportions above and below the image, and I quote from his writing: "The length of the outspread arms is equal to the height of the man. From below the chin to the top of the head is 1/8 the height of the man. From the chest to the head is 1/4 of the height of the man. The maximum width of the shoulders contains 1/4 of the man," and so forth. It's interesting, the abiding Renaissance belief that harmonious proportions extend far beyond the page or the canvas or the facade of a building or the plan of a city. Rather, it upholds the harmony and divinity of the cosmos. It grounds the perfectly proportioned object within the perfection of the universe. And in that sense, the Vitruvian Man links the corporeal human existence to the broader universal order, a profound statement of humanism. I want to bring in one last piece from Siena, Florence's southern neighbor, that offers a visual conception of the cosmos itself. Giovanni di Paolo juxtaposes God the Father's act of creation and the fall of man in one splendid picture. Siena was Florence's longtime rival, but never recovered from the devastation of the 14th century plague. Many Sienese painters, like Giovanni di Paolo, were visionaries who valued the imaginative over the cerebral. The circular object we see here is our universe. Earth sits at the center, surrounded by elemental rings, earth, fire, wind, and water. And the planets and this dab of gold, that is the sun, and then the constellations. This is a 15th century anatomy of the universe. To its right is paradise with its 4 rivers and Adam and Eve expelled from Eden by a golden-winged angel. It's a biblical narrative, but also a map of the world, a map of our entire human existence, tracing it back to Adam and Eve, but also situating it in this conception of our world. And so Renaissance art became an extension, an expression of both scientific and spiritual philosophy. Art became a way to interrogate universal truths and meditate on the human condition, whether through biblical narratives of creation or destruction, or through anatomical investigations and geometric constructions. For polymaths like Piero della Francesca and Leonardo da Vinci, the arts and sciences were united as one. Painting was a space for mathematical experimentation. Drawing was a means for anatomical study. Indeed, art was a vehicle for exploring and expressing scientific ideas. It's this interdisciplinary unity that makes the Renaissance so beautiful. Next time, we'll tie together the threads of the early Renaissance by diving once again into Florentine aesthetics and politics, following up with the Medici in the tumult of the 1470s. The young, vigorous Lorenzo de' Medici now leads the city. He narrowly escapes assassination. The Medici dynasty soon enters a state of precipitous decline, and there's an artist who directly and indirectly documented the whole thing, Sandro Botticelli. I hope to see you next time for a survey of Botticelli's career, which will round out the story of the early Renaissance.